Terminal is quiet the way airports always are at night, a strange, hollow kind of peace that feels borrowed. The fluorescent lights hum overhead, a few travelers drag luggage across polished floors. Everything looks completely, unremarkably normal. And that's the problem. Jenny and Paula are two flight attendants working a late-night domestic flight out of Los Angeles International. Jenny is newer, a little nervous, the kind of person who still smiles too hard when a passenger complains. Paula is seasoned, unbothered, moving through the pre-flight checklist with the mechanical ease of someone who has done this 800 times. They're staffing a small regional flight, not a transcontinental behemoth, just a modest jet heading to Nashville, the kind of flight nobody thinks twice about. The passengers begin boarding, and right away you get a sense of the cast of people about to share this cabin. There's George, a heavy-set man traveling alone, already sweating before he's through the jetway, nervous, gripping a small animal carrier that seems to shift and scratch from the inside. He tells Jenny it's a cat. He says it nervously. Jenny smiles politely and doesn't press it. That detail, that rattling, restless carrier gets tucked away in the back of your mind, and it will stay there. There's Sheila, a teenage boy traveling alone, sullen the way teenagers are when they'd rather be anywhere else. There's a couple, Ralph and Susan, clearly arguing before they've even found their seats. There's Ed, an older man with a quiet face and a quiet way about him, a schoolteacher named Henry, and a large, difficult man named Willard who's rude to Paula the moment he sits down, already demanding a drink. And then there's Dr. Bernard. The narrator moves through the cabin. Dr. Bernard boards last, just barely making the gate. He's well-dressed, composed, carrying only a slim briefcase. He greets no one, takes his seat, opens nothing, just sits, staring ahead, very still in the way that certain people are still, not relaxed, but controlled, as though stillness is a discipline, not a comfort. The cabin door closes. The plane pushes back from the gate, and for a few minutes, it really does look like a normal flight. Jenny runs through the safety demonstration. Paula handles drinks. Willard complains. Ralph and Susan bicker in hushed voices. Sheila puts in headphones. Ed reads a paperback. The engines roar. The wheels leave the ground. Los Angeles shrinks beneath them, all light and distance, and the plane climbs into the darkness above it. And then George starts sweating harder. Not the kind of sweating that comes from nerves or a stuffy cabin. This is different. This is drenching. He grips both armrests and his knuckles go pale. His breathing changes. Jenny notices it from the galley, that tight, labored pull of air that tells you something is wrong with a person, even before you know what it is. She approaches him, asks if he's okay. He says yes. He says it too fast, looking away, and the animal carrier at his feet shifts again. She goes back to the galley and tells Paula something seems off with the man in the window seat. The narrator shifts tone. Paula checks on him a few minutes later. George has gotten worse. He's no longer just sweating. His color has gone wrong, a grayish-greenish pallor that belongs on someone much sicker, someone who should be in a hospital, not 30,000 feet in the air. He tells Paula he just needs water. He reaches down and touches the top of the carrier almost unconsciously, like a habit, like he's checking on something he shouldn't have. Paula gets the water. She brings it to him. He takes one sip, and then he goes completely rigid and crashes out of his seat into the aisle. The cabin erupts, not into screaming, not immediately. First, it goes into that terrible silence that comes when something violent happens in a public space and nobody can process it fast enough to react. George is on the floor. His body is convulsing. His teeth are locked together. His eyes are open, but rolled partially back, seeing nothing. Jenny calls the cockpit immediately. She tells the pilots they have a medical emergency. The pilots begin the protocol, checking for any medical personnel on board. Ed stands up. Turns out he's a retired EMT. He moves down the aisle with a calm that doesn't belong in this moment. Kneels beside George, checks his pulse, checks his airway. He's alive. He's very wrong. The narrator paints a scene of tension. They get George back into his seat. They restrain him gently with seatbelt extenders. He drifts in and out of consciousness, muttering things nobody can quite understand. His skin is burning to the touch, a fever that seems impossibly high, climbing by the minute. Ed tells Jenny this doesn't look like a cardiac event. It doesn't look like a stroke. It looks like an infection, a fast one. Nobody connects it yet to the carrier. Nobody thinks to look inside. The pilots make the call. They're diverting. They're not going to Nashville. They're going to put this plane down at the nearest major airport and get this man to a hospital. The passengers are told there's been a medical situation on board. Most of them accept it with the mild irritation of people who just want to get where they're going. But Dr. Bernard says nothing. He looks at George from across the aisle with an expression that isn't concern. It isn't even curiosity. It looks almost like recognition. The plane begins its descent, and George, strapped into his seat, slick with sweat and fever, makes a sound, a low, wet, guttural sound, and turns his head towards the passenger next to him, and snaps his teeth together, hard. Nobody on that plane knows it yet. Not Jenny, not Paula, not Ed, the retired EMT who has seen more emergencies than he can count, not even the pilots who are already coordinating with ground control. But this flight, it is never going to land the way it was supposed to. The plane touches down at a cargo terminal, not a passenger gate, the kind of facility that exists at the edge of large airports, surrounded by chain-link fencing and floodlights, and the low industrial silence of a building that doesn't expect people. Something is already wrong with the landing. There's no ambulance waiting. There's no medical team standing by on the tarmac with a stretcher and a gurney, the way there should be when a plane calls in an emergency divert. There are vehicles, dark SUVs, unmarked, parked at a distance, and there are figures in them, but they don't come out. They're watching. Jenny notices it immediately. She looks through the cabin window at the tarmac and feels the wrongness of it like a cold hand at the back of her neck. She asks the cockpit why there's no medical crew. The pilots tell her they were instructed to hold, that someone is coming, to keep everyone calm and keep the doors closed. Keep the doors closed. That instruction lands strangely. Doors closed is takeoff language, not arrival language. That's the kind of instruction you give when something outside needs to be kept outside, or when something inside needs to be kept inside. Back in the cabin, George has woken up. He shouldn't be able to sit up. His fever, based on everything Ed has seen, should have him near unconscious, but George is sitting upright, and the expression on his face is not the expression of a sick man. It's something older than sickness, something more animal. He's no longer sweating. He's completely still. His eyes have changed, not medically changed, not visibly in any clinical sense, but the person behind them is not the same person who boarded this flight. He lunges at the passenger beside him. His name is Henry, the school teacher, a quiet, careful man who has not said much since boarding. George grabs him by the collar and bites him on the neck and the shoulder with a ferocity that is completely incomprehensible in a human being. Henry screams. The cabin explodes into chaos. People are standing, stumbling over each other, lurching backward into the aisle. Ed and Willard, the difficult, rude Willard who has suddenly become relevant, grab George and drag him off. It takes both of them. George fights with a strength that makes no biological sense, a kind of locked mechanical strength, like something that no longer feels pain because it no longer registers it as a warning. Here is something critical to understand about infectious disease and neurological function, something that will matter deeply for everything that follows. Certain pathogens, particularly those that affect the brain's limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, can suppress the fear response and pain processing entirely, while amplifying aggression pathways. The host organism becomes functionally incapable of stopping, not because it wants to hurt, because the thing driving it isn't the person, it's the infection, and the infection has one directive: spread. George is not trying to hurt Henry. George is trying to infect him. They lock George in the plane's small lavatory. The door shakes. He pounds against it from inside, not frantically, not the desperate hammering of a person trying to escape, but rhythmically, mechanically, over and over, with a patience that is somehow more disturbing than the violence. Henry is bleeding heavily. Ed applies pressure. Susan, Ralph's wife, who it turns out is a nurse, helps stabilize him. But Henry's color is already changing, already beginning that gray shift that George showed before everything went wrong. It's happening faster in Henry, much faster. Dr. Bernhard stands up. He hasn't moved during any of this. He has sat completely still through the screaming, the attack, the chaos, and now he stands up with a composure that stops everyone cold. He looks at Ed. He looks at Jenny. He says very quietly that everyone needs to listen to him right now. He tells them he knows what this is. He says it's a pathogen. He says it's transmitted through saliva, through bites, through direct contact with infected fluid. He says the incubation is extremely rapid, faster in some people than others, depending on immune response. He says it affects the brain. He says it makes the infected aggressive, dangerous. He says, and this is the part that lands like a stone dropped into still water, that he has been studying this pathogen for some time. Jenny asks him why he was on this flight. He doesn't answer. She asks him again. I was transporting a sample, he says. Everyone looks at the carrier on the floor next to George's empty seat. Nobody moves towards it. Finally, Willard asks the question everyone is thinking. If Bernhard was transporting whatever this is, was it contained? Is the pathogen loose in this cabin right now? Have any of them already been exposed? Bernhard is quiet for one long, terrible moment. The carrier should have been sealed, he says, but George tampered with it. Later, much later, they will learn that the carrier didn't contain a cat. It contained infected rats, specimens being transported as part of an unsanctioned study. George had discovered this somehow before the flight. He'd opened the carrier in the terminal bathroom out of curiosity, or concern, or stupidity, and one of the rats had bitten him. By the time he walked down the jetway and found his seat, the clock was already running. But right now, none of that matters. What matters is that Henry is starting to shake in his seat. What matters is that the lavatory door has gone quiet. What matters is that the figures in those dark SUVs on the tarmac still haven't come out. And what matters most of all, the detail that Paula spots when she looks at the terminal building and sees men in full hazmat suits moving towards the plane, is that those men are not carrying a stretcher. They're carrying equipment used to seal buildings, not to help the people inside, to make sure they stay there. Here is the moment when fear becomes something different. Up until now, the passengers have been operating on adrenaline and confusion, the primal, short-term panic of a bad situation that you still believe has a solution. Someone will come, someone will fix this, the authorities will arrive, and there will be protocol and order, and everything will be handled. But when you watch hazmat teams seal the terminal doors from the outside, that belief dies, and what replaces it is something much harder to manage, not panic. Panic is loud and exhausting and burns itself out. What replaces it is the quiet, cold understanding that you are alone in this and that the people outside are not coming to save you, they are containing you. The passengers have moved off the plane and into the terminal itself. This happens after Henry, pale, shaking, wrong-eyed Henry, grabs Susan by the wrist in the cabin and she screams for everyone to get off the aircraft. The evacuation is fast and disorganized. People grab what they can. Jenny takes a first aid kit. Ed takes the defibrillator. Paula stays close to Shyla, the teenage boy, because something in her recognizes that he has no one else. Inside the terminal, the lights are dim and institutional. Corridors branch off in multiple directions. Loading bays, a staff break room, cargo processing areas, maintenance tunnels. It is a building designed for packages and freight, not people. And it has that feeling, the feeling of a place that doesn't expect human fear. Dr. Bernhard explains the pathogen again, more fully now. He calls it a modified strain, a rabies-adjacent virus. And here is where the educational layer becomes impossible to ignore, because what Bernhard is describing is grounded in something very real. Rabies is one of the oldest known viral infections in human history. It has an almost perfect fatality rate once symptoms appear. It attacks the central nervous system. It causes aggression, hypersalivation, confusion, and eventually a state that strips the infected of recognizable human behavior. The virus in this film is fictional, but its mechanics are borrowed from virology that keeps actual researchers awake at night. Modified pathogens, viruses engineered or evolved to transmit faster, incubate faster, resist immune response, are not a hypothetical. They are an active field of biosecurity concern worldwide. Bernhard was studying whether the incubation window could be shortened further. He succeeded. The problem with being the person who succeeds at that particular experiment is the question that naturally follows. What were you planning to do with it? Nobody asks Bernhard that directly. Not yet. The group explores the terminal. They find that the communications have been cut. No landlines, no functioning computers in the public areas. Cell signals are being jammed. Whatever agency sealed this building, they were thorough. They did not leave a door open. They did not leave a way to call for help. And then they find the first infected terminal worker. He had been alone in the building when the plane landed, a maintenance worker who crossed paths with something or someone in the chaos of the evacuation, because his neck bears the unmistakable mark of a bite wound. He comes out of a maintenance corridor moving the way the infected move, not running, not stumbling, but locked into a forward trajectory with no hesitation, no reading of the room, no self-preservation instinct whatsoever, because the self-preservation instinct has been replaced. The infection has rewritten the directive. Ed tries to subdue him. Willard, and here is where Willard becomes important in a way nobody expected when they first met him as the rude, unpleasant man in seat C, Willard has combat training, military background. He doesn't explain this, he just acts on it, and the efficiency with which he handles the infected maintenance worker tells you everything about who he is beneath the unpleasantness. He is not a coward. He is a man who built walls because walls have kept him alive before. They lock the maintenance worker in a storage room, but the question is already hanging in the air. How many more are there? And more immediately, Henry is still on that plane. They left Henry on the plane when the evacuation happened. He was restrained, yes, belted into his seat and zip-tied at the wrists by Ed before anyone else thought to do it, but restraint only contains a person. It doesn't stop progression, and the progression of this pathogen is relentless. Paula volunteers to go back to the plane. Jenny tells her absolutely not. They argue, quickly, urgently, the way two people argue when they both know neither of them is wrong. Going back is dangerous. Not going back means Henry eventually frees himself and becomes a problem that finds them, instead of a problem they can manage. While they're arguing, Shyla disappears. Teenagers do the worst possible things at the worst possible moments, not because they're stupid, but because they are wired to test limits and reject authority precisely when authority is the only thing that could save them. Shyla has wandered down a a maintenance corridor because he spotted something, a service tunnel that might lead to an exit. He texts this to Jenny on a phone that barely has a bar of signal before the jammer seems to catch it. Jenny goes after him, and that is when the plane's lavatory door, the one they locked George in, stops being a sound in the background and starts being an active problem, because somewhere in the sequence of the evacuation, in the rush and the fear and the shouting, someone left the jetway door open. George is no longer in the lavatory. George is somewhere in this terminal. And behind the sealed doors, in the SUVs on the tarmac, the figures are still watching, still waiting, still making no move to help anyone inside. The question that nobody has said out loud but everyone is thinking is not, how do we survive this? It's, who else in this building is already gone? George finds them before they find George. He comes out of the darkness of a loading bay corridor, and the first person he reaches is Ralph, Susan's husband, the man who spent the entire flight arguing with his wife about something that now seems so completely cosmically irrelevant that it barely registers as a memory. Ralph doesn't have time to run. George is on him before the warning shout even leaves Willard's mouth. Ralph survives the initial attack. Willard and Ed pull George off him, but Ralph has been bitten on the forearm, deeply, and everyone in that group knows what that means because Bernhard has explained it clearly and the evidence is all around them. Susan, who is a nurse, who has spent the last hour holding herself together through sheer professional discipline, looks at her husband's arm. She looks at his face. She does not cry. She becomes very still instead, and that stillness is somehow worse than tears. She takes Ralph's hand, and she tells him she loves him, and Ralph, who was arguing with her 45 minutes ago somewhere over the California coast, Ralph who in a normal world they would have landed and had a real conversation and probably worked it out, Ralph squeezes her hand back and says he knows. There is nothing medically that can be done. Bernhard confirms this with the flat honesty of a scientist who has stopped softening information. The pathogen is in the bloodstream. The progression has begun. It will take time. How much time, he cannot say with certainty, but it will happen. They have to decide what to do with Ralph. This is not a decision that has a right answer. It is the kind of decision that reveals something permanent about the people making it, the kind of decision that once made cannot be unmade. They can restrain him, as they restrained Henry. They can separate him from the group immediately. They can, and Willard says this plainly, without cruelty, just with the military pragmatism that is his particular kind of mercy, address the situation before it becomes a danger to the others. Susan ends the conversation by saying that nobody is going to do anything to her husband, and the expression on her face when she says it is not a plea, it is a boundary, and for the moment everyone respects it. They restrain Ralph. Jenny has found Shyla in the maintenance corridor. The service tunnel he found is real. It leads to a back section of the terminal building, a sealed exit that opens onto a restricted area of the tarmac. The door is heavy and bolted from the outside, but the bolt is mechanical, not electronic, and Shyla is 17 and convinced that mechanical problems have mechanical solutions. He has been working on it with a piece of rebar he found leaning against a wall. Jenny tells him to stop. She tells him the people outside are not going to let them walk out. She tells him they need to think. Shyla tells her he is thinking. He tells her that thinking and doing nothing look exactly the same from the outside, and he refuses to just wait in a building full of people turning into something else. He is not wrong. Jenny knows he is not wrong, and that is the part that costs her. She stays with him. They work on the door together. Back with the main group, Ed has begun doing something quiet and methodical and brave. He has been moving through the terminal, checking rooms, cataloging what's there. He finds a security office with a camera monitor. The building's internal CCTV is still running on its own local server, untethered from the outside network. He can see the whole terminal from here, multiple screens showing multiple corridors, and on one of those screens he counts 4 infected individuals moving through the building. Not 1, not 2, 4. George, The maintenance worker they thought they'd secured. The storage room door is open and the storage room is empty. Two others he doesn't recognize, people in terminal uniforms who must have been in the building when everything started, who found George or Henry or the carrier before the passengers ever came in from the plane. The building has been compromised far more deeply than anyone realized. Ed brings this information back to the group. He delivers it without dramatizing it, the way he has delivered every piece of bad news since the flight, cleanly, factually, with the voice of a man who understands that information is more useful than comfort. There are 4 infected individuals moving freely in this terminal. The group has Ralph restrained and turning. They have no communication with outside. They have no weapons beyond improvised ones. And Dr. Bernhard has been increasingly quiet, increasingly evasive. Willard is the first to say it directly. He turns to Bernhard and tells him that everything that happened tonight started with whatever was in that carrier. He tells Bernhard that the men in the SUVs on the tarmac, the men who sealed the building, they knew this was a possibility. They were positioned before the plane even landed, which means someone told them, which means someone knew this flight might need to be contained. Bernhard doesn't deny it. He says he filed a protocol report before the flight. He says he notified his organization that he was transporting a live sample. He says the vehicles on the tarmac are part of a containment team that was activated when his report stopped coming in after George's initial episode. They're not going to open those doors. No, Bernhard says. Not until they're certain. Certain of what? Bernhard is quiet. Certain that nothing viable is left inside. Ed says softly, and that is the moment the air changes in the room. Not loud, not explosive. It changes the way temperature changes in a room just before a storm, incrementally, and then all at once. Everyone understands simultaneously what Bernhard just confirmed. The containment protocol is not a rescue protocol. It is a termination protocol. They are not being held in this building until help is no longer necessary. They are being held in this building until help is no longer necessary. Susan looks at Ralph, restrained and already changing, already becoming something unrecognizable in the eyes. She looks at Bernhard. She does not say anything. She does not need to. Jenny gets the door open. It takes almost everything Shyla has, the rebar, a second piece of metal they found in a tool cabinet, Jenny's weight against the frame while Shyla drives the lever, but the bolt gives. The door swings outward. Cold night air hits them like a physical thing, carrying the smell of jet fuel and the open tarmac and the dark sky beyond. They are not free yet. The hazmat team on the tarmac has already noticed the door. 2 figures are moving toward them, not running, but purposeful, their suits white and faceless under the floodlights. Jenny tells Shyla to wait. She steps out and she shouts at them, shouts that there are uninfected survivors inside, that not everyone in this building has been exposed, that they cannot simply seal this and walk away. One of the hazmat figures stops. The other keeps walking toward the door. Jenny stands her ground. There's a moment here that the film earns fully, a moment of pure, exposed human defiance that has nothing tactical about it, nothing strategic, nothing clever. Jenny is not a soldier. She's a flight attendant on what was supposed to be a routine domestic route, and she is standing on a dark tarmac at the edge of a restricted airport facility, telling a nameless, faceless hazmat operative that the people inside her care are not expendable. She says it without a speech. She just doesn't move. The figure stops. Radio communication is happening inside those suits. You can see the posture change, the slight hesitation. Someone further up the chain is being consulted, and whoever that person is, they make a calculation. They do not open the building, but they don't remove Jenny either. Inside, the situation has reached its final shape. Bernard has led Willard and Ed to a section of the terminal he clearly knows, not from the building's public layout, but from something else. He has been in this terminal before. He knows where the medical storage lockers are, because this is not the first time cargo with this particular pathogen has moved through this facility. What Bernard finds in the storage locker is a containment compound, an experimental antiviral agent that has shown some suppressive effect on the pathogen in lab conditions. Not a cure, he is very clear about this. Not a reversal, but a suppressor, something that may slow progression enough in someone recently exposed to give them a fighting chance. He gives it to Ed. Ed looks at it. Then Ed looks at Willard, who was in close physical contact with George during the restraint on the plane. Willard, who has been quiet and capable all night. Willard, who, when Ed looks at him closely now, really looks, has a small laceration on his left forearm, partially hidden by his sleeve. Willard sees Ed see it. For a moment, neither of them says anything. "How long?" Ed asks. "I don't know," Willard says. "Maybe it was on the plane, maybe before." He says it without self-pity, without dramatics. The walls he built are still up, even now, especially now. Ed gives Willard the compound without asking Bernard. Bernard starts to object. This is a limited quantity. This is untested in vivo. There are liability and protocol considerations. And Willard looks at him with an expression that makes Bernard go quiet in the way that scientists occasionally go quiet when they encounter a problem that cannot be resolved with data. The infected have found the main corridor. George comes first, and then the maintenance worker, and then two others, two terminal employees whose names nobody knows, but whose faces are burned into everyone's memory now, because they were someone before this. They were people who came to work tonight and expected to go home. What happens next is not heroic in any movie sense. There is no action sequence with clean choreography and swelling music. It is terrifying and desperate and ugly in the way that real survival situations are ugly, improvised and costly, and nothing anyone would choose. Willard handles it. Ed helps. The compound in Willard's system is doing something. He is stronger, clearer, more controlled than he should be, but it is not making him invulnerable. It is just making him enough. Susan never leaves Ralph's side. When the thing that was Ralph finally breaks the restraints, Susan is the one who deals with it. She does it alone, in the quiet of the side room where they'd kept him, and nobody sees it happen. When she comes out, she is still a nurse, still composed in the way she has been composed all night. She doesn't speak for a long time. Outside, Jenny has not moved from the tarmac. The standoff with the hazmat team has become something else. One of the figures has removed their hood, and he is a young man, genuinely young, who looks like he would rather be anywhere on Earth than where he is standing right now. He tells Jenny that his orders are to maintain containment. He tells her he's sorry. He says it like he means it. Jenny tells him she has two people coming out of that building right now. She tells him they have not been bitten. She tells him that if he has any interest in living with himself after tonight, he will stand aside. Shyla comes through the door. Then Paula. Then Ed supporting Willard, who is walking but costs something with every step. And then Jenny turns back to the door and waits, because Bernard is still inside. And after a moment, Bernard walks out too, without his briefcase, without the composure that has defined him all night. Just a man who built a thing and watched it run away from him, carrying whatever that weight is for the rest of his life. The young hazmat operative speaks into his radio. There's a pause. Then the floodlights shift. An ambulance moves out from behind the SUVs. They're not free, really, not yet. There will be quarantine. There will be tests, interviews, protocols, weeks of uncertainty before anyone in this group is cleared to return to the world they left when they walked down that jetway. Willard will spend months in a medical facility while researchers determine whether the compound Bernard gave him worked the way they hoped. Nobody will talk to the press. Nobody will be given answers that fully satisfy them. But they are outside. They are breathing tarmac air and cold night, and the building behind them is sealed again, properly sealed finally, and the sky above Los Angeles is beginning the very first gray suggestion of morning. Shyla sits down on the tarmac and puts her head in her hands, not crying, just done, just finally allowing herself to be done. Jenny stands next to Paula, and they don't say anything for a long time because there is nothing that fits. Somewhere in that building, Henry is still on the plane, restrained in his seat. George is somewhere in the dark corridors. The infected terminal workers are sealed in with them, and Dr. Bernard's carrier, that rattling, scratching carrier that nobody thought twice about when George boarded the plane, sits somewhere in the cargo hold of a plane that will never complete its scheduled flight to Nashville. There are things that can be designed to spread faster than any natural pathogen. There are things that can be put in a briefcase or a carrier and moved through an airport at 11 o'clock at night on a routine domestic flight. Most of them never get out, but that comfort only holds until the night it doesn't. Jenny looks at the plane through the terminal windows. She looks at the lights of the runway. She looks at the sky getting lighter. She thinks about the safety demonstration she gave 4 hours ago, the one she has given hundreds of times, the one that everyone ignores, the one that exists because someone somewhere decided that people on a plane deserve to know what to do when things go wrong. She wonders what the demonstration is for a night like this one. She doesn't have an answer. Neither does anyone else. What gets you, really gets you about this story is that it started with a man on a normal flight who just couldn't leave the carrier alone. One decision, one moment of curiosity at the wrong time. That's the whole chain. If you've been here this long, you're not a passive viewer. You're someone who actually thinks about these stories. Subscribe. Don't miss what we uncover next. The end.